Welcome, everyone, to this Our Whole Lives Taking Flight. We welcome you today to our topic of child safety and mandatory reporting advice from a pediatrician. My name is Reverend Amy Johnson, and I serve as the Minister for Sexuality, Education, and Justice in the United Church of Christ, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm going to welcome who's here today, and then we'll go ahead and get started with this topic. Melanie?
Hello, everybody. I am Dr. Melanie Davis. I'm the Unitarian Universalist Association's Our Whole Lives Program Manager. Happy to be here today with our special guest, Dr. Verena Brown. Verena? Oh, you're on mute.
That's helpful, isn't it? So I'm Dr. Verena Brown, and I am a child abuse pediatrician. So I see kids to the age of 17 who have either been physically abused, sexually abused, or neglected, and then help with education wherever I can.
Thanks so much for being here today. And before we get started, I do want to just let you know, I think our title has been pretty self-explanatory, but just a reminder that this is a sensitive topic. And that can be sensitive for those of us who are sitting here on this panel today, as well as any of you who are joining us. So we just want to give you a reminder about permission for self-care. And that might look like you pausing and stepping away and doing, looking at this later on the recording, because these are always recorded. Or it may look like you take a breath, or you just really notice where your body is in the room and what you are aware of, what you can see and what you can hear and what you can smell and what you're touching. So just a reminder to be really gentle and kind with yourself today as we talk about this very tender topic. With that, one other thing, if you have questions along the way, we do invite you to please use the Q&A feature. It's really hard for us to monitor questions that are thrown in the chat, so we ask you to please use the chat for your intros, maybe a comment if you have, but on the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button. And if you have questions, it's really easier for us to monitor those. And we'll get to those either during the presentation or afterwards. We'll be sure to try to address any questions that you have in the Q&A. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Verena. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we will play this from the start. Everybody can see this okay? Okay. So, like I mentioned, I see children who have been through physical abuse or sexual abuse and neglect. For today's presentation, I'm going to focus on the sexual abuse, but I'm going to touch on the physical abuse too, because sometimes they happen hand in hand, and this is what we see all the time. But I wanted to take you through some of the signs of abuse. Oh yeah, I have no financial disclosures. I don't know if that matters to you guys, but it'd be nice if I had financial disclosures, but I don't. And what we really want you to know is, what are some possible signs that a child is being abused? 2 or 3 signs, and we'll get into that. And then we really want you to be able to list some action steps if you're ever in a situation where a child is disclosing abuse to you. I understand this is a heavy topic, especially if you're not in the field. So I don't have any yucky pictures in this lecture. I have replaced my yucky pictures with nice, serene, pretty pictures that will help maybe balance things out a little bit. These are my 2 boys riding their bicycles. So when you think about what child maltreatment is, right? There's just a general definition from the WHO, which is any child that is under the age of 18 that goes through any kind of physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, neglect. Of course, we have human trafficking, which is a big deal also, especially in the big cities. I'm in Atlanta, and we have quite a bit of it here. And then exposure to domestic violence can also be a sign of maltreatment because of if you're in a home where there is domestic violence, a lot of times you may end up being abused yourself. And certainly there's a psychological component of that abuse to a child. And it's, if you are a parent who is not, or a caretaker who's not being able to protect that child, that is also considered neglect. So when we think about child abuse and neglect, and we think about these different components, right? One of the things that we see a lot of is physical abuse. And honestly, I see this more so in babies and toddlers, and younger children. But that can be anywhere from, beating a child, kicking a child. Certain acts of corporal punishment are considered that as well. One of the other things that we see a lot of is emotional abuse. And this is really, really actually hard to diagnose because it can be so subtle, and it's not something that, folks talk about a lot. But things like name calling, scapegoating, rejection, withholding love, all of those things would fall under that category. Neglect, we see a lot of nutritional neglect. And unfortunately, it's not necessarily due to poverty. It can be just withholding of food for punishment, but other basic needs, housing, clothing, education, things like that. And what's important to notice about neglect is that sometimes something is being done willfully, and sometimes it is neglect because the family is having certain barriers. So being able to identify, is this a family that has high needs that are not being met because of whatever structural, societal things are going on? Or is it a situation where this child is being punished with neglect? And those are very different ways of approaching the situation, right? Because it's going to be vastly different in what you're going to do for that family. And then, of course, sexual abuse. So when we are looking at risk factors for, and the slide says physical abuse, but it can also go for sexual abuse too. Anytime that you have a home where there is high stress, that is going to heighten the level of possible abuse of various sorts, right? So we talked about domestic violence. One of the things that we see a lot is not only the psychological abuse in that, but also children getting mixed up in the crossfire of that abuse. So one of the things that I see, for example, in my field is mom will be holding a baby, dad is beating mom, right? And baby gets struck, right? So then they end up coming to the emergency department. Substance abuse issues, right? If unfortunately, if you have an addiction and you are not in the proper mental status to take care of a child, things can happen. And I have seen things from a parent getting violent and also sexual abuse. I had this horrendous case of this 13-year-old girl whose mother unfortunately had died when she was 5. She was living with the dad. From what she describes, dad was a pretty decent dad, doing the best he could. She thinks that dad may have been on some sort of, using some sort of substance, but she wasn't sure what it was. One night he lost it. He was not in his right mind and proceeded to rape her for the entire night, and doing some also terrible things like stabbing and things like that. She came in, she was in terrible shape. But in talking to her, I was like, has this anything ever happened like this before? And she was in complete shock. He's like, he's never done anything like this to me before. And it turns out that he was high on many things. So substance abuse is definitely a risk factor. Other thing is, when you look at the literature, so this is especially true for sexual abuse, non-related males in the home. And if you think about it, yes, there's some lovely step parents out there, so I'm not talking about that. But when you are a perpetrator of sexual abuse, right, you are going to want to find children. And so you're going to go to places where the children are. And it is fairly easy to maybe meet a single mom who is in need of love and relationship, and maybe looking for someone to be a good father figure to her family. And you get into the door that way, right? So, and that's not just in the home. When we look at the picture of child sexual perpetrators, these unfortunately are going to be the people who are in your community members, right? I did a training for the Boy Scouts just a couple of months ago, and one of the panelists that was a survivor of sexual abuse had been molested as a kid by his Boy Scout leader, who was like a big member of the Boy Scouts. But all the kids, the parents trusted him. He was working directly with boys, teenage boys, and he had access. So that's things to be mindful of when you're looking at perpetrators.
That's, Verena, if I could interrupt, that's why when we do facilitator trainings, we really emphasize that churches and congregations have safe church or safe congregation policies in place before they start offering an OWL program. One of the stipulations is that you never have one adult with children, that there's always pairs of adults. So I just like to remind folks that they should look to make sure that their congregations or churches have policies like that in place.
That's a really good policy to have. And I wish more places had trainings like that, because that's exactly right. If you are of ill intent, you are going to go to a place where the kids are, be that wherever it is, right? And so you need to have those safety nets in place and not just assume that just because you're a nice you appear to be a nice person. I mean, think about all the people that we hear about, even in the media, who have perped on children, and they were in places of high regard. But nobody thought any different because, such a nice guy, he's a leader and whatever, right? So that can be dangerous. The other thing that we see a lot is parents that have their own history of abuse, whether that is sexual, physical, or even just corporal punishment in their background. There's just something psychological about trauma begetting trauma. And we see these parents a lot who have not worked through their own childhood trauma and end up finding similar partners. Part of my job is working at my clinic, with seeing sexual abuse, mostly sexual abuse victims in my clinic. And one of the questions that I always ask the caretaker, which is usually the mom who brings them in, is, what's your history? And I will say 9 times out of 10, they've been sexually abused themselves. So, and 9 times out of 10, they didn't get any treatment, or they weren't heard, or no one believed them. That's huge. It happened to me. I told a family member, I told a clergy person, I told whoever, and no one believed me. Right. And so it remains unsettled in that person's life, and it gets repeated in their children. Special needs kids, especially if they're not verbal, because they can't tell on you, right? So be aware of that. Multiple children, this is more true of the physical abuse. Like if you have twins in the home, it adds to stress. So when in the physical abuse world, this tends to be a risk factor. And then again, for physical abuse, unrealistic expectations of children. So kids who, a parent that may, I'll use an example. So when I was in Virginia, we served a lot of military families, and I had this 3-year-old who got really beaten up by the father, whose expectation was that he would fold his clothes perfectly. And the dad was a pretty firm disciplinarian. He had high expectations, but you really can't expect a 3-year-old to do that. And so when there's a mismatch between the developmental age of your child and what you expect them to do, and if you're a person who believes in physical discipline, or who, has a propensity for anger, things can go awry, like it did for that child. So if you have a family in high stress situations, not always, of course, but that can be a situation where just be more aware for any sort of maltreatment, or even neglect in the form of not a willful neglect. So just keep that in mind. So when we look at child abuse physically, right, and this could be sexual or physical abuse, but when I approach a kid in the hospital, the first thing that I'm going to look at is, what does the child actually look like? Now, for sexual abuse, typically they're not going to have any physical injuries. I'm not going to get into that in that lecture because it gets real medical, but a lot of people think that even with a horrendous rape that is happening over and over and over, you don't necessarily have any physical symptoms. You don't necessarily have injuries because of the way that the body is built, right? Now, the closer you are to the abuse, let's say you had a sexual assault yesterday and it's been 24 hours and you come into our ER, it's more common at that point that you might find injury. But if you come in 3-5 days later, your body has had time to heal. Okay. The tissue inside of your vulva is like the tissue inside of your mouth. So if you can imagine biting the side of your mouth, it might hurt, it might get swollen, it might even bleed a little bit. But 3 days later, you're like, oh, that's all done. I'm good. So your vulva is the same way. So if you don't come in right away, there's a good chance that by the time I get to you, your exam is going to be normal. And it doesn't mean that nothing happened, right? It just means that your body did what it's supposed to do and healed up. So with physical abuse, especially on the little kids, you're looking at injuries that sometimes are biomechanically impossible, right? So, kids that have lots of bruising to their face and the parent says, oh, he fell off the bed. I'm like, it's not the killer bed. I'm sorry, that didn't happen, right? If it's too severe, if it's more than one organ system involved, of course, that's not going to be for you guys. It's just so that you guys know what we're looking for. Or injuries in various stages of healing. So if you're noticing a kid in your congregation or the people that you're serving who's coming in with a lot of bruises all the time, and they're not typical places where people bruise, like they're not on their elbows or their shins, they might be in their cheeks, it might be, on meaty portions of their arm. Start paying attention. And if the parent's like, oh, he's just real clumsy, I mean, I don't know, right? That's a red flag. Kids are pretty resilient. So notice, okay? The other thing that we see a lot is a changing history. So they might say to you, oh, they're really clumsy. They might tell you they fell down the stairs, or for the sim event, oh, actually, what they were doing is jumping on the trampoline, and things don't make sense. They don't add up, right? It doesn't seem right, especially with the pattern of injuries that you're seeing. Kids that have injuries that are not developmentally plausible. So we see a lot of babies with bruises, and folks kind of blow it off because like, oh boy, babies have fragile skin. They really don't. Babies are really not as fragile as we think they are. And they bruise just as easily or not easily as grownups do. So that's one of the things that gets missed a lot, but there's really nothing a baby is doing that would bruise them up. So we say in our field, if you can't cruise, you can't bruise. Because if you're just lying there being a baby, you're not going to get injured, right? Things like in history that can't be corroborated. Were you alone? Was there anybody else there? Have there been siblings with concerns? And this is true for sexual abuse too, right? If there is a concern that someone has been messing with more than one person, there might be some truth to that. So pay attention. And this is one of the things that we see. We'll get into this when we talk about why kids disclose, but kids will start talking if they have younger siblings a lot of times because they don't want it to happen to their younger siblings. So just pay attention to that. What are the psychological symptoms? Well, this is tricky because this list of symptoms can apply to so many different things, right? So you can't really just jump to the fact that, oh, they're being abused if they have these symptoms, but it should raise a red flag for that something is happening in this child's life, right? So anxiety, depression, a kid who has some hyperarousal or vigilance symptoms, they're always on alert, they're always jumpy or fidgety, right? Regression, especially in younger kids. So you have a 6-year-old who has been potty trained and now they're wetting the bed every day. It's not normal. So I need to get checked out from a physician to make sure that there's not physically something going on. But sometimes that has to do with they are being abused or something is going on in the home. There is a psychosomatic reason, right, behind what's going on. Having lots of nightmares. All of a sudden, a kid becomes angry or aggressive, right? And if I was talking to He's a retired detective, police detective, and he used to work sexual assault cases in kids, and he had been a victim or survivor when he was raped when he was 12 by another man. And I asked him, what would you have wanted people to notice? Because he didn't tell anybody until he was a grown-up, which is common. What would you have wanted people to notice at the time that this happened? And he said, I went from being a straight A student to getting C's and D's overnight. And nobody asked me. And I started getting into fights. I started getting in trouble at school. And people just thought, oh, he's a teenager. He's just becoming a problem. And he's like, no, I just didn't know what to do with my emotions. Right. So if you see a kid who has been having some anger issues, impulsive behavior, especially if this is a big shift from what you know of this kid, start wondering what's happening.
I think this could also be an opportunity for OWL facilitators to be in conversation with their Christian educators or their directors of religious education who have been following these children through other religious education programs. So that could be a first stop. Like, is this child always behaving like this, or is this a new behavior?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. If you have a way to historically look at what the behavior pattern have been and notice that this is a shift, then that's a really important question to have, and it will so benefit the child. And like I said, it doesn't mean that this child has been abused. It could be that, the family's going through something, they lost a parent or, a grandparent that they were close to. It could be that they're, the family, they're getting a divorce, right? It could be that their house burned down. I mean, these are symptoms of trauma. They're not necessarily symptoms of abuse, but as mandated reporters, we need to have that in the back of our mind that this is a possibility and this is how it can present itself. So just, as people who love children and work with children, just be aware of what's happening with these children and not be afraid to ask the questions. And we'll talk a little bit later about asking the questions. So sexual aggression. And what I mean by that is a kid might be, in your classroom touching another kid inappropriately, or saying sexual words or things of that nature. Now, this one, when you look at the studies of children who are sexually reactive, it's really easy for us to think you are being sexually inappropriate, so you must have been sexually abused. And it's not wrong to wonder that. And it can certainly be that. However, interestingly, the studies show that even more so than sexual abuse is physical abuse. And you might wonder, well, that's weird. But if you think about it in the context of, if you have, now, sexual reactivity, sexual behavior problems this definition is for children 12 and under. I'm not talking about a 16-year-old, okay? But if you have, a 10-year-old, an 8-year-old who is maybe grabbing somebody's genitals in a harsh way and hurting them, right? It may not be, they're not necessarily thinking about it as a sexual act for sexual pleasure because they don't have a context. But if they've been in a situation when they've seen violence, either domestic violence in the home or where they have been hurt themselves, what we consider to be a sexual act because it involved genitals, for them might just be aggression in general. So it's important to note that there's something wrong, but don't jump to sexual abuse. And the reason I'm saying don't jump to that, consider it heavily, don't dismiss it. But don't pigeonhole, because then if it's not sexual abuse, then you'll be like, oh, it's fine. Johnny's just a mean guy. No, something's happening, right? So don't pigeonhole to think that just because it involves the genitals, it has to be sexual. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. So other things you might notice is lack of concentration. And a lot of our kids, they'll come into clinic and it's like they have 5 million diagnoses. They have ADHD, and they have oppositional defiance disorder, and they have, learning disabilities. And it's like, and you're on all the meds. And sometimes it's just PTSD, which is big enough, right? But like, this is all trauma response. So it's really difficult to treat a kid appropriately if you don't have the right diagnosis, right? So know that lack of concentration doesn't mean that Johnny's not smart or that Johnny has ADHD. Maybe those things are true, but it could be PTSD, mimicking other things. And the only way Johnny's going to get better is if you talk about the trauma and you get proper therapy for that. Self-harm. Like all my teenage girls cut. Oh, she's a cutter. Yeah, she is. And self-harm is something that people do because they need to feel their pain, their emotional pain in a different way. It is a coping mechanism. It is a difficult coping mechanism, but it is a coping mechanism. And if you see that, know that absolutely something is happening. Again, it doesn't have to be abuse. It can be a million other things, but something's not okay. Okay, there's some misconceptions about who abuse people, right? We talked about it a little bit, like, oh, if they're normal looking and they're well educated and middle class or upper middle class, they're not going to abuse kids. And this kind of goes into, there is literature out there about social bias in child abuse reporting and who gets called to protective services and who doesn't. And so we have to be really mindful that we're not accusing people because maybe they're a little rough around the edges, and not accusing people because they're high society. And we see this. So something to think about. The other misconception is that children who are being abused would immediately tell a parent or a trusted adult. Not the case. And this is especially true for sexual abuse. Okay. Most kids don't disclose. And there's so many reasons why that is. And even if it's not a parent who's doing the abuse and it happens outside of the home, there's a lot of kids that are still not going to disclose. And we'll talk about why that is. The other thing is that people or children who are being abused will show evidence of abuse. In physical abuse, that it can be true, but it doesn't have to be. In sexual abuse, 95% of the kids that I see do not have any evidence of abuse because of what we talked about earlier, that the body heals itself very, very quickly and very, very well. Okay, so why is it so common? Let's focus a little bit on sex abuse for a minute. Why is it so common to stay silent? We know that they do, even in the face of actual evidence. So if you look at this study back from 2007, what they looked at are kids that either had video evidence because some perpetrator filmed it or because it got caught on video surveillance that were abused, and 40% of them still denied it. No, this is not me on this video. That didn't happen. Other kids who had gonorrhea, which is an STD, it's an STI. It is. You're not going to get gonorrhea from the toilet seat, even though that's like the mythology out there, right? Kids still say nothing happened. So even in the face of having proof, a lot of kids will not tell. And why is that? Oh, this is a nice little chart that tells like when kids will tell, right? So we know that about a quarter of them are never, ever, ever going to disclose. Some of them will say, depending on who it is, within 24 hours, the numbers vary, but a lot of them are just never going to say anything for their entire life. Okay. Well, one of the things that happens is there may be a lot of fear around disclosing abuse. Let's say that it happened. Let's say your parents are super supportive and amazing, but Uncle Bob has issues and Uncle Bob molests you, right? Uncle Bob may say, if you tell somebody, I'm going to go to jail. And you like Uncle Bob. You don't like the abuse, but you like Uncle Bob. You don't want Uncle Bob to go to jail. Okay. Or Uncle Bob may say, if you tell somebody, no one's going to believe you and they're going to call you a liar. Well, if you're a little kid, you don't want to be called a liar. Because what happens to liars? People don't like them, right? Maybe that you're going to be missing out on love. Or they might say, you know what? Mrs. Funkelbob is really sinister, but we hear this all the time. If you say something, I'm going to kill your family. Well, you don't want your mom and dad to be killed, so you're not going to say anything. There's so many reasons why kids don't say, right? And if you get into their mindset, it's pretty reasonable. Now, let's say that it's an abuse that's going in the home, right? Let's say that it's your father or your stepfather, and you know it's going to hurt your mom, right? Or you know, if you're old enough, especially in my younger teens, older teens, that maybe they're the breadwinner, right? Maybe maybe you have I had this girl, she was 14, and she was incredible. She was being molested by her stepdad for years, and she never told her mom. And one time her mom picked up her phone and saw messages from the stepdad to the girl. Hey, you know, I want to do whatever tonight, and after your mom goes to, I don't know why people text these things, stupid, but they did. And so she confronted her daughter, and her daughter said, well, yeah, this has been going on, but you know, he's touched me, like, you know, she like denied any penile vaginal penetration. You know, he only did it a couple times. Mom confronted the stepdad. They all had a kumbaya. He promised never to do it again. Right. Mistake number one. Okay. So a year later, so this is when I meet her, as a year later. Finds more messages, right? So at this point, mom finally calls the police, finally decides to do something about it. And she comes to clinic. I see her. She is denying that anything ever happened other than touching, which is plenty, by the way. But to the point of the story, she comes back positive for trichomonas. I bring her back in. I talk to her by herself. And she admitted to me that he had actually been, you know, full out raping her. But if you saw the mother-daughter dynamic, the mom was a puddle of a mess. The entire clinic visit that I'm talking, because I'm talking to them separately, right? She's a puddle of a mess, which is okay because she's going through the situation, but it was a whole lot about, but what about me? What about me? What about me? And my life. And, you know, and when I went to talk to the girl, she was, you know, mom was like, you know, in her 40s, and this girl's 14. Well, it was like the opposite. I mean, this girl was just so grown up and so not stoic, but gathered. And it was very clear that this girl was mothering her mother. So that's another reason why kids don't disclose, right? They're keeping everything together. They're the grown-ups in the family, and that's hard. So if a kid discloses, it may not all be all at once. They might be testing the water. She kind of tested the water here, right? She said, well, okay, there's touching, but she didn't tell everything else. Her mom had a come apart, and by the way, ended up not really protecting her because she forgave the dad. I was like, well, I'm not going to say anymore. I tested the water. It's not well received, right? So know that it can be extremely long process for kids to tell the whole story. What it might tell you today may not be complete. And you got to let them have that process, because these kids, their trust has been broken, right? And in order for them to say, they need to know that they can trust you. Even if you're like the most trustworthy person in the world, they're still testing the water, and that's okay.
Verena, I have a question. There was a question in the question box, which was about teens fearing retribution.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking that might be about parents that don't trust the teen and kick them out of the home or threaten that. Mm-hmm. But the other question I would have is, at what point would somebody who is a volunteer at their church or their congregation start hearing these stories and then decide it's time to report? Or how long do they let this process go of disclosure before they take action? Is that?
Yeah, and if I can just jump in as well, because I think that I've heard many disclosures over the years. I used to work in the schools as a social worker, and I'd never ever heard like a really clear, complete disclosure. It's always some sort of something that's implied or an innuendo or some signs or things like that. So yeah, I'd really appreciate hearing your recommendation on that. Like when a volunteer working with kids or teens in a program like OWL, what would be the tipping point? Kind of some tips on that.
Sure. So if it's well, it's hard sometimes depending on how clear or unclear the kid may be, which is why you need to ask more questions and take the time to have those conversations, right? And we'll go over like how to ask questions in a couple slides. But once you have enough information, even if it's minimal, to know that something illegal happened, right? Any kind of touching, any kind of pornography, any kind of, it doesn't have to be full out assault. You're mandated to report, and you don't have to be sure. This is something else I'm going to cover a little bit later. You don't actually have to be sure that it's happening in order to report it. In most states, reporting is anonymous. You don't have to disclose who you are when you report to authorities, and you can say like, "This is my concern," and it's their job to do an investigation. It's not your job to have proof that something is happening before you disclose, because really mandated reporting is reporting a concern, not reporting a known truth, right? So anytime you have to ask yourself, if this were my kid or a child that I knew and loved very well, if it's like, a child that you don't know very well, they're working with, like, would I want this investigated? And if it's yes, then you do it, right? Or if you just really think that there's something very wrong here, report. And then certainly if you have any inkling that something is illegal, report. And then see where it lands. And I think it's hard, right? Because you don't want to believe is something negative of someone that maybe you work with or in your congregation with, even in, in general pediatricians' offices, right? If you've been seeing a child for a long time and you know that family and you bond with that family and a disclosure comes out, you're like, oh my God, I don't want to believe this. Out of this lovely family that I've been serving for, 12 years. I've known this kid since she was a baby, and this dad is so great. We're on the community board together. Report. Because that is your duty. Your duty is greater to the kid. I hope that helps. And also know that recantation happens all the time. What is recantation? It's the taking back of the allegation. Why do children recant? Because now it's been reported and maybe the police is in their home and somebody's getting in trouble, right? Maybe now the mom who was using mom and dad, and I know it's kind of binary, but like just for the example, mom is dependent somehow on dad for putting food on the table, and now he's going to potentially go to jail, right? And you're wrecking the family in your head as a little kid. So you recant. You say, no, you know what? Never mind. I made it up. Right? Or if nobody's believing you anyway and calling you all sorts of names or making you feel ashamed and guilty, which happens all the time, fine. Stop talking about it. I made it up. Right. We've had cases where, unfortunately what happens is a child will recant, the case will get dropped, and then it will get reopened again when that person perpetrates on a different child outside of that family unit usually. And you're like, oh, maybe that kid was telling the truth after all. Sorry about that. All right. So know that just because a child takes it back doesn't mean that they're lying. most often means that they have really good psychological reasons, traumatic reasons to take it back. Okay. So we talked about this a little bit, but we didn't talk about shame. There is a lot of shame in child sexual abuse. This is one of the things that I run into most often in clinic, and something that I try to bring in to talking to especially my teens. And what I hear is, I was just lying there. I didn't even scream. I didn't fight back. I brought it on somehow, right? Or especially the girls who are survivors of date rape, where they were in it for the romantic interlude, but maybe they weren't in it for the sex, right? So I went out with this boy. We went to this place. I wasn't expecting the boy to do XYZ. What I wanted was this. And then I got too scared to say no. And then I didn't fight back, but I was still in the place, right? I shouldn't have been in the place. It's my fault. So a lot of times they won't disclose because they feel like they brought it onto themselves, and they have to understand that it's not your fault. You know, no is no, even if it's an initial no that gets, well, especially if it's initial no that gets overstepped later, and no during the act is still no, and even if you can't fight back, there's psychological, biological reasons for that with fight, flight, or freeze. It's how our bodies react. So we go a lot into the fact that freezing is the third F that we don't talk about as much, is something that happens very often, especially to women. Your body can't fight back. You can't scream. You can't say no, because you are literally frozen, because that is what your biology is doing in order for your survival at that time. So we have to kind of go through that a little bit. The other thing is male sex. So male victims of sexual abuse often don't disclose because there's a lot of shame in that still. And then there's also questions about their sexuality at that point. Even in 2023, it's still a big thing. So just be aware of that as well. All right, so I'm going to skip that because I want to get to other things. Reasons kids will disclose. So supportive parents is really helpful. It doesn't mean that the kid will disclose, but if you're a nice parent that is open about sexuality and having these conversations with kids, and this is something that you can talk about in your home, the likelihood of them disclosing to you is higher. All right. The other thing is distance from perpetrators, any kind of family members that you might find that are not supportive. So we see this a lot in divorce, that kids are getting sexually abused or otherwise abused for a long time. The parents get divorced, they go to different homes, and now the child discloses. The issue sometimes becomes that on rare occasion, there might be parents that are using things against another parent for custody or battles or things like that. And the disclosure might get blown off if you don't understand that this is when, this is prime time for disclosure to happen, because now the child feels safe, and not just blow it off as like, oh, that mom is making that up because, she's got a thing against dad. I mean, maybe, but more likely it's because the child is now feeling safe away from the perpetrator, right? Kids do disclose at educational programs at school. We have a prevention team that goes around having sex ed talks to high school students, and every time there is a disclosure, 1 or 2, sometimes 3 kids will come up later and say, hey, this is happening to me. So these programs are really actually very great. And they're not, you guys are in this program, so I'm speaking to the choir here, but it's not like, oh yeah, go ahead and go have sex. No, that's not what it's all about. It's about knowing your body, knowing safety, and knowing what's okay and not okay. The other reason is, and this is sweet and also heartbreaking to me, I've had so many kids that have disclosed because their sibling were getting to the age of their own abuse happened. This has been happening to me for X number of years, but now my sister is 8, and he's been messing with me since I was 8, and I don't want him to mess with her. And it's kind of heartbreaking, but also at the same time, it's like, wow, that bond is really, really powerful. So, like we talked about, who is a child going to disclose to and how? Like we said, it's going to be a partial disclosure. They're going to be testing you. So let's say that you are the person that they trust enough to start saying something to. Know that they're going to be dipping those toes in the water. Are you believing them? Are you going to protect them? Are you listening to them? Are you going off the deep end, right? You got to have a good poker face here, because the stuff is shocking and you don't want to believe that this is happening to a kid. But if your reaction is any way of resistance or fear, they're going to stop. And they may not choose another person. No pressure, but just know that this is a thing. So be there present with them and reaffirm, okay? Especially in a sense, in a case we talked about recantation, knowing that can happen, reaffirming them that you believe them is really, really important. Know that's my kid, by the way. He's 4 now, but that was his first Halloween. I really love this picture and it makes me happy. Know that when kids are disclosing to you, it may seem confusing. It may seem like the story isn't following. There is this misconception that children don't remember things as well, and that children can be coerced more easily than adults. The literature is not really great on either of those things, but it seems like they can remember just as well, honestly, and they're very, very accurate. But what happens is, and this is anybody that has been through trauma, and this is not just kids, but also adults, the trauma response itself is going to jumble your brain. So there may be things that you blocked out, and there may be things that you don't remember in order. It's kind of like this. And I totally stole this analogy from a friend of mine who gives this talk too. She's another child abuse pediatrician, and I think it makes sense. So let's say that you're going to the grocery store, and then you're going to the bank, and then you're going to the mall, and you're listing all of your errands that you're doing for that day. And you write each thing on a note card. Going to the bank. No, next note card, going to the grocery store, and so on and so forth. And you have a pile of note cards of everything you're going to do. All of a sudden, you trip over your dog and you drop all your note cards, right? You pick them all up. Some of them may have fallen underneath, your coffee table, and you can't find them. You think you have most of them, but now they're all off order, and you're trying to go through them and recount the steps of your day. And most of the stuff is there, but it's all in different order, and you don't remember what order you have them. That's how trauma memory happens. So just because a kid is having a hard time telling the story in a way that makes sense, or maybe missing some things, it doesn't mean that isn't true. Okay? It is trauma response, and that is normal. So we talked about that. What about you as the person receiving all this stuff? Do not panic. Don't panic. Just try to stay as calm as possible. Do whatever you need to do. Take some deep breaths. Go get yourself a cup of tea and say, let me go grab myself a cup of tea so I can listen to you. And make your cup of tea and take some deep breaths and center yourself, and then go back, because it's going to be a big talk and you need to be present at that time. Okay? Don't do this with a group of people. Please don't do this in front of other grown-ups. I mean, I understand that you might have different rules about how to approach this for the child's own protection, but be very mindful of how you're doing this. Maybe go to a courtyard where it's public but kind of private, or a cafeteria so you can talk with each other, but they're still around different people, right? Don't do it in earshot of other people. Don't expect to get a ton of information right away for the reasons that we just talked about. Aim to get what is necessary for the moment to see, do I need to report this or not? Okay, leave the nitty-gritty to authorities. That's not your job. Now, if the kid offers the nitty-gritty, great, but that is not your job. You just need what's necessary. build rapport with the child. I mean, hopefully if this is a kid that is coming to you, you probably know them anyway. But if there's a space where you're going to have this heavy topic, you can, after you get back from your cup of tea, like, hey, did you have a nice time at your birthday party or whatever, like ease them into it. It's like, I know you had something really important to talk about. I'd love to hear it. And now they're at ease. Now you've kind of, it's not just like this tense moment, right? Of course, they might just like blah, verbal diarrhea to you. That's fine. But you have to like kind of engage it with who the child actually is and what they actually need at the moment. And don't force it. Don't force the conversation. Because if they're comfortable talking to you, you don't want to make them uncomfortable. Keep your facial expression neutral. Like I said, you have that poker face. And reassure the child that they are believed and they are not in trouble. You are not going to be in trouble for this. I just want to be able to be here to support you. And please do not promise not to tell, because that is the whole point.
Yeah. And if I can just jump in here, I think one of the things that I have found really helpful in terms of our whole lives programs and building covenants and those kind of things around confidentiality is to have that in your covenant right up front, that if somebody's being hurt or if something's happening, that you are going to get them help. And that might mean that you need to talk to somebody outside of the group, but also framing it as expanding confidentiality instead of breaking confidentiality. Like, you're not going to go post this on Facebook or Twitter or anything like that, but you're going to bring in whoever is needed to get that person the help that they need to stay safe.
I love that, expanding confidentiality. That's beautiful. I like that a lot. I have to steal it, by the way. This is a little drawing that my oldest son made me, and it was really cute. This is when he was younger. He can draw better now, but it was still really cute. So what kind of questions do you ask, right? Don't ask leading questions. And what I mean by that, like the specifics, instead of asking, were you in the bathroom when this happened? Well, where were you when this happened? Keep it open-ended. The younger the child, this is going to be really important, right? And this is like a prime example of like the kids that come to the ED sometimes. So you got a 3-year-old and mom or dad or grandma, actually oftentimes grandma, will catch them masturbating, which is a normal developmental thing. You're 3, you found your parts, you're masturbating. Maybe grandma doesn't know this, right? Because grandma was raised at a different time. And she's like, oh my God, somebody must have touched you. Who touched you, right? Like making the assumption, or did somebody touch you, right? And the little, 3-year-old is like, well, they're 3. They want to please you. So they're like, yeah, sure did. Well, who did it? Little 3-year-old, Johnny did it, because they have to please you somehow, right? So they're just giving you answers, not that they're trying to lie. So they're 3, they don't have that thinking. And now all of a sudden you're in my ED because you're masturbating and Johnny's in trouble, right? So don't ask leading questions. Keep it open-ended. Where were you? What was happening? Tell me more. All right. Physical abuse cases, did daddy hit you? Must have punched you, right? If you see injuries on a child, I'm worried about this boo-boo. How did it happen? What happened? How'd you get your boo-boo? And let them tell you. And if they're ready to tell you, they will. And if they're not ready to tell you, then don't push it. With the physical abuse cases, especially like in my early elementary school kids, I'll ask this question of, how did you get this boo-boo? Tell me about it. Especially the kids that come in and they're really beat up, right? And a lot of times they'll tell me, I don't know. And full well that they know, because it's just happened and they were just, they just were admitted for this. And sometimes I will say, do you not know, or do you not want to tell me? And it's okay either way. You don't have to tell me. And a lot of times they'll say, I don't want to tell you. And that tells you everything, and that's okay. You don't press them. So avoid yes or no questions, because kids are going to want to give you, an answer. And if you can't expound on that answer, that's yes or no, you're really locking yourself in. better. You mentioned, in the case, like if somebody comes into my clinic, you mentioned to your mommy that somebody touched your privates. Who was that person? Instead of saying, it was your daddy or it was whoever, leave it open-ended. Excuse me. And remember that depending on the age or the trauma response, their answers may not be entirely accurate or time, as far as timing is concerned. I had a case that this was a 10-year-old that had trichomonas, and she said that grandma's boyfriend was the one that was molesting her. And she had given a couple of dates, but they were off. The dates were off because she would have been in school around that time. And he ended up getting off. Like they did not find him guilty. Which is preposterous to me. But one of the reasons the judge gave, which the judge didn't understand, is like, well, she gave the wrong dates because she would have been in school, so she must be lying. No, she has no concept of time, is what that is. So be mindful of that. So other good, good questions, like we talked, how did you get this boo-boo? Tell me what happened. Tell me more about that. What happened next? How did you feel? How did your body feel? Tell me more about the day that it happened. So you're building a narrative without feeding the narrative. You're letting the child give you the narrative, and you're painting that way.
Oh, I was just going to chime in here. A couple things. We're getting close to the top of the hour, but also I think that here's where there's sort of kind of some, I think, confusion sometimes around how much we need to ask in order to just have the concern to report, because a lot of times we are counseling people not to do like a full-on interview, right, with a kid, but just to know if there's something that is enough information that now I'm concerned, then I would report, but to not do too much question asking, because then that sometimes impedes an investigation. Can you speak to that like real quick?
Yeah, and so this will be my last slide. Okay, so if you're working with kids, you're going to be a mandated reporter, and so to your point, right, you're going to call Department of Children's Services, call police, call even when you're unsure, and you have to be ready to provide the information for them. So the things that are helpful to get, because you're right, you want to leave the forensic interview to the authorities, and you don't want to get into the nitty-gritty, but you need to know enough in order for the police or DCS to know where to go and what to do, and when around when it happened, especially for medical evaluation, right? So because if it happened less than 3 to 5 days ago, then they're going to maybe need a sexual assault kit, versus if it happened last year, that's too late for evidence collection. So those things are helpful. Now the police can get that, but it might be helpful to kind of have an idea. So who, if you can, you don't have to, but if you can, where, because it's a jurisdiction issue when you are calling law enforcement, don't have to know the address, but was it at your mommy's house? Was it, at daycare, right? So that we know where you're going to, and some general facts of the incidents, if they want to tell you. Don't press it if they don't. Was it penile-vaginal penetration? Was it touching? Was it, whatever it was? If you can get some basic facts about those 3 main things, and then approximately when, knowing that timing is going to potentially be off. But if you have a general timeline, it doesn't have to be perfect. Happened around the 4th of July. Okay, we got an idea. So no, don't do a forensic interview, but even those open-ended questions are going to help you get the basic information that you need instead of shutting the child down. Okay, in the interest of time, what other questions do we have?
I think you answered them all. There were a couple questions in the question box about teens fearing retaliation that I think you answered. Amy, do you have any?
No, I think that was really great. You obviously have so much wisdom and experience, Verena. Thank you so much for being here. I think the idea of asking those open-ended questions to get that basic information, that who, where, when, and some general facts, that's really, really helpful. I also know just from my own personal experiences that, a lot of times you're going to be calling CPS if it has to do with the home. and calling law enforcement if it's somebody outside the home. So that's just a tip for folks when they're reporting. And there are a lot of resources out there for survivors of sexual trauma. So I'm seeing up here, you've got your local child advocacy center. I know where I live, it's the King County Sexual Assault Resource Center, and they have a lot of resources about that. There was a question that Melanie and I answered offline that I just want to lift up, which was that somebody was asking about what to do, what resources to have if they're trying to help volunteers understand about child sexual abuse. And there are some places that do that and specialize in that. And particularly one of the ones that the UCC has used in different places is called Presidium. So they have like slides and case scenarios that volunteers watch to help with understanding about sexual abuse in local church and like camp settings and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I would say most UU congregations belong to Church Mutual Insurance. And there are a lot of resources on the Church Mutual website. But also, yes, somebody asked if they could show this to the leaders in their congregation. Absolutely. This recording will be posted on the UCC's OWL pages and on the UUA OWL Facilitator Resources page. So yeah, you're welcome to just wait a couple days for the UCC to post it on YouTube, and then you'll be able to share this as you wish.
Yeah, and that's how you would be able to look at the slides again. And if you need to do that, there's one other thing here in the question Q&A that I'm seeing, which is a reminder to get support for yourself if you need to report. And that is absolutely true. You as a person who is the front line of receiving that information and reporting, it's a really good idea to get some support for yourself. Somebody's still asking about the retaliation question. And, the thing is that that can happen. There can be retaliation. The alternative, though, is not reporting. And so sometimes these are not cut and dry decisions that people have to make. They have to weigh a lot of things about what is best. What is your position as a mandatory reporter? What is best in the situation? And I think that those aren't, there's not a super one size fits all answer for that.
I think one of the things that we have learned from the racism, racism in our whole lives, or anti-racism and all, whatever the webinar is called, is that decisions like this should not be made in isolation. So you have a co-facilitator. If you're in an OWL program and you are working with somebody who discloses, you can talk it over with your co-facilitator, talk it over with whoever is supervising your program, or your minister, or your board president. You're not alone in this. You can talk to somebody else.
And worried about retaliation on the child. Is the child going to be safe in their disclosure? There have been plenty of times where children will say, I don't feel safe going back home. Right. And so it's important to have a mechanism in your organization to what happens when that child is at your facility and they're saying, I don't want to go home today. I'm not safe. I told you that this happened and I'm afraid now, but I needed to tell somebody. So what's the plan for your institution? It's easier in the hospital because then you're like, okay, well, we'll just admit you, or in our clinics, like, well, you could stay here until, DCS or police show up. But if you are at your congregation or you're at your school or whatever, how are you going to handle that? And that's going to be specific to your institution.
Yeah, so thank you so much. And also somebody asked if they were able to show this video with their leadership, their church leadership, I think. And yes, these are on YouTube, and you are able to access that playlist and do that if you need to. We are over time, and I know that our fabulous admin Andrea is gearing up for another webinar on this channel, so we're going to wrap up, and thank you again so much. Verena, for being here today.